last time, Pak Gita mentioned about responses that the Indonesian government could take in saving the economy during this difficult situation. And today, the topic is a bit different. It is about negotiations in the COVID-19 era, especially within and between governments. Because as you might have heard or read in the news, there are a lot of cases in which decisions made by the central government or the local government are not synchronized with each other, and that might be due to unsuccessful negotiations between the two. So today, Pak Gita will share his knowledge about that aspect of the situation that we're currently in. And as for the guidelines for the webinar, I'd like to remind everyone here to not click the share screen in any circumstances. And to reduce the network usage, please leave the video and microphones off until you're given the chance to ask a question. And in regards to the Q&A segment, for participants, please raise your hands. And bear in mind that priorities will be given to SGPP Indonesia students. So one student for every 3 public questioners. And as for the viewers, participants who are participating through Zoom or watching us through our live broadcast on YouTube, please ask your questions if you have any through the chat section, and we'll compile the questions and then I'll ask them for you. And please don't forget to state your institution and name. And one more thing is that today is the first time we're going live on YouTube, and we're using the webinar system. So there might be some things that might be technical difficulties and others. So yeah, please be considerate of that. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Pak Gita to start his lecture. Thank you, Pak.
Okay, thank you, Fendry, for the kind introduction. I'm going to try to spend more time asking questions at the rate that the last time we had a discussion. I did realize later on that there were a lot of people that actually would have wanted to ask questions, but didn't get their chances. So what I'll do this morning is to basically flip through some of the pages that I'd gone through last week to give context, to what's happening with the COVID-19 and how it has affected the global economy. But also later on, I'll also dwell into how the COVID-19 development has and is likely to affect the way we deal with the rest of the world, and the way actually the national level type of government would have to deal with the regional and the local levels of governments, not necessarily just within Indonesia, but I think within many parts of the world. If we could flip to the first page of the presentation. Okay, that's basically just the table of contents. I'll talk about the unprecedented health crisis that's enveloping the world and the unprecedented economic crisis that's been going on for the last few weeks, and how it's likely to continue on for the next few weeks, if not months, and some sort of a possible solution, which I've touched upon last week in the webinar, and also lastly, how we might be seeing, other possible consequences in the context of how we're dealing with the rest of the world and how we're dealing with each other, as in between the federal government and also the regional and local governments. Next page. Next. So in the last 7 days, we've seen many more casualties. globally speaking. The last time I spoke, we only had about 2 million people that would have been affected. And as of a couple of days ago, we've seen a spike in the numbers from 2 million to about 2.4 to 2.5 million that would have been affected by the coronavirus. And the number of deaths has also increased quite dramatically. 7 days ago, it was hovering at around 100,000 people that would have died. Now we're looking at about 160 million people. But if we look at the mortality rates across the many countries that we're seeing, be it Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, China, Spain, all the way through, France and Indonesia, we're seeing the mortality rates staying at where they were last week. And at the global level, we're looking at a mortality rate of around 6 to 7%, whereas at the each individual country levels, we're seeing consistency in terms of Italy's and the UK's hovering at around 12% in terms of mortality rates, whereas China and the USA are hovering at around 4%, and Indonesia is hovering at around 9%. And this is not great in the sense that we would have expected the mortality rate to actually come down further, in addition to our expectation and hope that the infections would actually, start tapering off, if not decelerating. But we're still seeing instances in a number of countries where, the flattening of the curve is not evident yet. Next. This is just to show that there has been flattening of the curves in a number of countries, while there hasn't been any evident flattening of the curves in a number of other countries, including in Indonesia, which has seen a few thousand people being infected, and the deaths. The number of deaths continuing to rise as to maintain the mortality rate in Indonesia at around 9%. Move on. Okay, the markets have shifted in a more positive manner in the last, I would say, couple of weeks, as much as I would have said last week that, ever since the beginning of February, the markets across the world would have corrected around 30%. We have seen some ascension in the U.S. capital markets and a couple of other capital markets, and also in Indonesia. But I think more meaningfully in the U.S. capital markets, and this, in my view, would have been highly attributable to the very fact that they did a massive quantitative easing, in the last 3 weeks. They have basically showered the markets with more than $2 trillion worth of liquidity in the markets, and that, I think, would have been the primary factor as to why the index in the U.S. stock market has gone up quite a bit from the earlier level of 20,000 to around 24,000 as of yesterday. I still hold the view that this is not of permanence. This is quite episodic because of the fact that we're still exposed to the health uncertainties, and we're also still exposed to the economic uncertainties, which I will elaborate a little bit later. Next. This basically explains how the staggering of the effects of the coronavirus on each geography's economic situations. I think China has been able to prove to the world that it's flattened the curve, and I think it's going to recover earlier than any other geographies around the world, namely the United States and Europe and developing economies. Indonesia falls into the category of developing economies, and I think it is falling at the tail end of the overall curve in the world. And that, I think, will basically have implications on how we're basically going through not only the demand shock but also the supply shock that's coming from different directions. Next. This just basically explains how the demand shock and the supply shock are occurring on a simultaneous basis. And we're basically witnessing tremendous, shock to the demand in Indonesia. Aggregate demand is basically falling by way of the decline in our day-to-day consumption, the decline in our investments, investments that could, come from overseas, but also investments that could come from domestic sources. Not a whole lot of companies are actually undertaking capital expenditures, and that has basically resulted in a huge, drop in investments in the country. And there's also been a drop in importation of goods and services, which would have explained a few days ago when the government announced a surplus, and that would not necessarily have been because of the uptick in the exports, but it would have been primarily because of the more than proportional decline in imports, which has basically yielded a surplus on the trade account. So while aggregate demand is falling, we're also seeing this affecting just about every sector. We have seen and heard in many other discussions as to what sectors are typically or likely or are actually being affected by the drop in aggregate demand, particularly the tourism sector, the hospitality sector, moving on to the other sectors, which are much more manufacturer oriented, all the way down to the e-commerce, marketplaces, and IT businesses, which would have also been affected. In essence, by way of the totality of the drop of aggregate demand, I'm not aware of any sector that is not likely or is not affected yet by the drop in aggregate demand. I think we can assume that for now that the demand for agricultural products is still very, very robust, just for the purpose of our needing to survive on a day-to-day basis. But by way of our changing our lifestyles in terms of staying at home, working from home, we have managed to basically stay efficiently, effectively at homes without actually going out to buy the junk food that we would actually be buying in previous times, without actually having to interact with people, without actually having to undertake any capital expenditures, without actually having to just about do anything that we would have done. And that, I think, has reflected in the a significant demand, a significant drop of demand for just about everything that we consume, be it goods and services. Next. Okay, we've talked about this last week. I've made some revision to the numbers. I think what is clear in that is that the United States, they have basically been increasing the number of tests that are being done on a daily basis, and this has brought about a higher ratio from the previous 7,000 on a per 1 million population basis to about 10,000 on a per 1 million basis. Indonesia similarly has also done more testing in the last 7 days, but unfortunately it's only brought up the ratio of 113 per 1 million to only about 150 per 1 million. I think as of 2 days ago, Indonesia has only done testing of about 40,000 people in Indonesia. They have been able to bring about more testing devices, but in terms of the number of people that they've actually tested, it only has gone up to about 40,000 as of a couple of days ago, and we're hopeful that this number will go up significantly as to bring about a much higher ratio than 150 per 1 million to hopefully in the 8, 9, or 10,000 people, so that we can actually figure out the denominator a lot more clearly, as we have seen in other countries such as Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even Malaysia, and also the United States. Malaysia has ramped up its testing, at 15 to 20,000 per day. I think they're looking at basically bringing up the ratio of testing to, you know, around 10,000 per 1 million. Next. Next page. This basically is an illustration of the different countries trying to stimulate their respective economies. At the risk of sounding redundant, the United States, again, they have basically come up with a two-pronged strategy, a fiscal approach and a monetary approach. On a fiscal front, they're basically coming up with a stimulus amounting to about 10% of their GDP, around $2.2 trillion. In addition to their monetary, if not aggressive monetary policy making, in basically quantitatively easing the economy with about $2.5 trillion in the last few weeks. Korea still on track in terms of undertaking its fiscal stimulus at around 3% of its GDP. And Singapore still on track in terms of, you know, stimulating the economy to, you know, up to $50 billion, which amounts to about 12% of its GDP. Indonesia still on track in terms of, you know, getting started with its 405 trillion rupees worth of stimulus at around 2.5% of the GDP. Clearly, Indonesia does not compare favorably in relative terms nor nominal terms with respect to some of these other countries, which include, you know, developing economies and also developed economies. If we could get somebody to mute, I'm hearing background noise. Okay, next page. And this is the breakdown. If I just want to highlight where, you know, the United States government, by way of its fiscal policy, it's allocating about $600 billion for individuals, and it's allocating, you know, around $500 billion for you know, corporations, and it's allocating around $300 to $400 billion for small medium enterprises, and it's going all the way down to the, you know, the municipals or the state and local governments, and also at the tail end they're allocating quite a significant amount, almost $200 billion for public services, primarily for health purposes or healthcare purposes. And this is, I think, likely to be augmented in the near foreseeable future, depending on how you know, they view in terms of their ability to contain the pandemic, if not get over that. Next. This is a composition of the 405 trillion rupees worth of stimulus package being done by the government. 75 trillion for healthcare purposes, in my view, is still not enough, just by the sheer lack of testing that's been done on a per 1 million basis at about 150 per 1 million, which is starkly lower than, you know, what other countries are doing on a per 1 million basis. And I also think that what's allocated for the business community, amounting to about 220 trillions, is still not enough by way of, you know, the magnitude that's already the magnitude of the impairment that's already happening within the real sector, not to mention the magnitude of the potential impairment that could happen to the banking industry. Next. This was the bond issuance that was issued some weeks ago, which basically is part of the fundraising activities being done by the Ministry of Finance as to try to come up with that $405 trillion rupiah, which is about $25 billion. So they've raised about $4.3 billion. I'm aware of the fact that they're exploring other possibilities of fundraising, be it in the international markets or also the domestic markets. I'm still holding the view that the international market is continuing to be stressed, particularly for non-AAA rated countries, if not instruments. And as we predicted last week on Tuesday, that there was likely to be a downgrade of ratings amongst many sovereigns and also corporations. Truly enough, just a few days ago, the Standard & Poor's, they have basically come up with a correction, if not a revision, to the ratings of Indonesia from a positive outlook, from a stable outlook to a negative outlook, by way of the potential stress on its fiscal, but also monetary, landscapes. And to the extent that this is going to exacerbate, then we're only likely to see further downward revisions, if not corrections, on the ratings of Indonesia. And this is not a unique situation, as we're seeing similar types of revisions or downward revisions from a rating standpoint being applied to sovereigns and also corporations around the world. Next. Okay, the unemployment rate in the US as of last week was related to about 17 million people that have filed on a cumulative basis for unemployment. In a matter of 7 days, the number has gone up from 17 million to 22 million people. And it's basically by the minute, by the hour, and by the day counting. And every minute, every hour, every day, as we count, it only means more and more people filing for unemployment. So with 22 million people, we're looking at about 16 to 17% hypothetical unemployment rate in the United States as of right now. And that is a vivid reflection of the speed with which this COVID-19 has affected in an adverse manner the economy of the largest economy of the world. The United States economy stands at around 21 to 22 trillion dollars. And it basically took about 3 years for the unemployment rate during the Great Depression to reach 24%, whereas this time around in 2020, it's only taken 2 months for the unemployment rate to go up from 3.3% to around 17%. And it is not an impossibility for this unemployment rate to go up to 25 to 30% just in the next few months, at the rate that the economic activities are continuing to be immobile and to be somewhat paralyzed. Next page. This is a picture of what happened in the 30s during the Great Depression in terms of how unemployment has skyrocketed over a 3-year period, as opposed to just a few weeks in this year, 2020, and how the GDP basically contracted for a few years, and how also things were deflationary for around 3 years. Next. This basically reflects upon the degree to which the government budget of every economy plays a role with respect to the GDP. The economies of the developed nations, i.e. the United States, South Korea, and Singapore, they're at around 30%, if not more, of the GDP. The government budgets of these three developed economies are roughly at around 30% of their respective GDPs, whereas the government budgets of the developing economies, i.e. Indonesia and Malaysia, they're still sub 20% of the GDP. What it means is that at a time like now, when the COVID-19 has basically tremendously and adversely affected our economies, the role that the government needs to play, the additional role that the government needs to play is only going to be much more for developing economies at the rate that we cannot be assuming that the private sector could actually be helping themselves any better, any more than the government. So as we have seen in terms of what the developed economies are doing, they have stepped up to the plate. Okay, either from a fiscal standpoint, but also from a monetary standpoint, and this clearly shows that the stepping up, by developing economies, including Indonesia, would need to be even more as compared to the stepping up being done by the developed economies, as to basically help salvage the respective economies. Next. This just shows a revision of the economic growth rates of various countries. I would still hold the view that this is a tentative illustration of where things could end up. I think a lot of it depends on what each country is likely to do in the near foreseeable future in terms of what they're gonna and how they're gonna stimulate their economy from a fiscal and monetary standpoint. I do believe that some countries may vary in terms of their stimuli with respect to the economies, and as a result of which the revised illustration of their economic growth rates, I think, is going to be different from whatever is being illustrated on this page. Next. This is a reaffirmation of what we have been talking and discussing in previous lectures in terms of the potential re-ratings of companies and also sovereigns by way of the COVID-19, and we have clearly seen it for real in the last few days in terms of Indonesia as being downgraded from a stable outlook to a negative outlook. As much as it is still maintaining the triple B rated or rating, but I do foresee that if we're not taking decisive action, I do foresee a possibility for further revision on the ratings of not only Indonesia's economy, but I think revisions or downward revisions on many other emerging economies and corporations also. Next. This clearly shows where the oil price has been behaving. As of last night, we saw many sound bites about the oil price dropping to around $10, if not, less than $10. And even the futures markets are showing that, oil price in the futures is likely to be priced at $0. I don't see that as a real possibility. I think that was just a reflection of basically the lack of liquidity in the futures market. I'm not there yet in terms of holding the view that in the future the price of oil will actually come down to zero, because I do foresee some sort of a pickup in aggregate demand, and any pickup in an aggregate demand will only entail the need for energy, and oil still plays quite a big part in everyday's energy equation. Next. This basically shows the correlation between the behavior of energy consumption vis-a-vis overall economic growth, or even contraction. We have seen in China, which announced their first quarter economic figures, inclusive of their contracting in the first quarter by 6.8%. So basically their economic activities contracted compared to the first quarter of 2019 by about 6.8%. And it's clearly almost directly correlated with the decline in their energy consumption, i.e. electricity and everything else, at more than 6% contraction of energy consumption or electricity consumption. So it's easy now to basically foresee where economic activities of various countries are going to lead up to, just by way of their usage of electricity and energy. And at the rate that the price of oil has plummeted significantly in the last few weeks, it only means that we can expect and foresee a further declination of energy usage. As such, we're only likely to see more and more contractionary behaviors or economic behaviors in many countries, including in Indonesia. I'm of the view that we're only likely to see a pretty meaningful contraction in Indonesia's economy only starting in the second quarter. because the COVID-19 really didn't start enveloping many of us, if not most of us, until the latter part of March of 2020. So we're likely to see some lagging in how it would affect our economy. And I think it's almost a sure bet that in the second quarter of 2020, Indonesia's economy is likely to basically contract. Next page. Can we maximize the page? Next page. Okay, this is basically an indication of the banking system of Indonesia. Clearly, the asset of the banking system of Indonesia hovers at around 8,000 trillions, okay, of which about 6,000 trillions are actually loans that are being lent out to creditors. And because of those loans, the banking system earns interest income. And the interest income on an annual basis, or at least what's expected to be earned this year in 2020, is around 800 trillion rupees, okay? So that gives you an idea of what the interest rate is on average. That's about, what, 12 to 13%, which is the rate at which the banks charge their clients for borrowing from the banks. So on one side of the equation, the banks are actually expecting to earn 800 something trillion rupees, whereas on the other side of the coin, they have to basically give interest incomes to the depositors who have basically deposited money to the banking system, and they actually have to give out interest incomes to the depositors at around 430 trillion rupees. So what I want to basically illustrate on this page is that if we were to assume that there is likely to be some sort of a decline or an impairment of economic activities, we can also assume that there's likely to be a stoppage, if not a decline, in the capacity of the banking system to earn all of that 830 trillion rupees. Now, on the assumption that they're not going to be able to earn all, if not most of that 830 trillion rupees of interest income, it's going to cause basically difficulties to the banking system because they have to basically pay out interest income to the depositors. They also have to pay salaries to their employees, and they also have to pay taxes, and they also have to pay dividends to their shareholders, be it the government or also the private, shareholders of the private bank companies. So I think we're already seeing stresses that are being basically placed or imposed upon the banking system. And this picture in the next few months is likely to get more complicated. Next. This one just basically tells you the total banking asset of about 8,200 trillions, made up of about 5,500 trillions of loans, while the rest are basically just, investments and securities and, other related items on the balance sheet. But I think what's relevant to know is, what's going to happen to the interest that's going to be earned on this 5,600 trillion rupees worth of loans, much of which is basically already collapsing because of the physical distancing policies that are being imposed upon the people by the government and also by themselves as a result of the lack of activity, as a result of the lack of immobility. There's clearly a lack of ability to basically pay interest to the banks by just about every sector of the economy, particularly the small and medium entrepreneurs. I think this is a good point to indicate the distinction between what we might have experienced in 1998 at the peak of the Asian financial crisis vis-a-vis what we're experiencing right now. In 1998, what actually helped salvage Indonesia's economy was actually the small, medium entrepreneurship. It was one of the most, if not the most resilient part of the economic pulse of Indonesia. Whereas today, because of the inability of people to move around and the inability of people to be active, just about every small, medium entrepreneur in Indonesia has been severely adversely affected. And this, I think, is cause for concern, because we are believers of the theory that, you know, in any economy, it's usually the small, medium entrepreneurship that has basically preserved the sustenance of the economy. As much as the economy also relies on the big corporations for job creation and all that good stuff. But the robust nature of just about every developing economy typically relates to the robust nature of the small, medium entrepreneurship, where in Indonesia, we have about 62 million small, medium entrepreneurs. Many of these, if not most of these, have been, you know, basically hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next page. So next. Next. I've talked about this in a number of occasions where, you know, on the assumption of the universal basic income, we are looking at about 324 trillion rupees worth of money that needs to be earned, if not compensated, to, you know, the 129 million people that are working, be it at the factories or also on a, you know, by themselves as small and medium entrepreneurs. And this is cause for concern, because about 40% of the 129 million people are not basically empowered, are not able to empower themselves to make a living or earn. You can quite safely assume that about, you know, 100 trillion rupees out of the 324 million trillion rupees that need to be earned on a monthly basis is basically not there. The capacity to earn, the capacity to pay about 100 trillion rupees out of the 324 trillion rupees that needs to be earned, if not paid, is not there. And this needs to be looked after in a very wise manner. And this is strictly for purposes of coming up with the necessary social safety nets. Next page. If we were to go on the assumption of basically providing social safety nets for the millions of people that are out of jobs or that can't basically function as a small, if not, you know, medium entrepreneur, we're looking at, you know, having to basically, you know, provide support for them, you know, for the next 6 months at least. And that comes up to about, you know, 600 trillions. In addition to that, we've got to come up with, you know, an economic support for the provision of, you know, healthcare capabilities, which would include the availing of, you know, the testing kits, the availing of the vitamins, including vitamin C, the availing of the other necessary medications, and the availing of hospital beds, the availing of nurses and doctors and all the relevant, you know, infrastructure. I'm of the view that, you know, we would probably need about 300 to 400 trillion rupees for everything, as to be able to basically zero in on the denominator, but also zero in on what it would take for us to basically get over the curve and the hump, and you know, medicate ourselves out of this you know, COVID-19 pandemic. And the remaining 300 trillions would be needed for the small, medium entrepreneurs, as for them to actually be able to function again as entrepreneurs. And the remaining 300 trillions would be relevant to those, you know, home industries and small industries that are actually labor intensive. This is just for the purposes of, you know, providing liquidity support so that we could actually have the necessary, you know, social safety nets in the next few months. Next page. Now, if we were to assume that maybe 40% of the banking system needs to be restructured, I think we can safely assume that a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of corporations that are exposed to the banking system. They are having difficulties as it is, meeting payroll requirements, meeting, utilities requirements, paying to PLN, paying for the water, or paying for just the basic operational expenditures, much less paying the banks for their monthly installments for principal and interest. So if you take 40% of the banking loans altogether, you're looking at about 40% times about 6,000 trillions. That amounts to about 2,400 trillion rupees. That's going to be needed so that we can actually sustain the economy. Why I'm pointing this out is that we are witnessing lots of companies right now that are on the brink of temporary impairment. And the most visible or evident example is the hospitality business or the food and beverage business, where we're seeing closures of restaurants on a massive basis, okay? And there is a good chance that 30 to 40% of these guys are not likely to be able to actually resurrect themselves on a permanent basis. Just because, when COVID-19 is over and done with, at a time when they need to basically go to the bank, they're not likely to be able to get credit again. Basically, they're about 30 to 40% of the food and beverage entrepreneurs are not likely to be able to stand up on their feet again, in terms of getting credit from the bank and in terms of being able to recruit, in terms of being able to operationalize themselves. So if these people are not being assisted, if not supported, the risk of transgressing from temporary impairment to permanent impairment is not small. Okay, and I could also hypothesize that if that sort of a scenario were to occur to the simplest low-hanging fruit part of the economy, such as food and beverage, it could very well apply to other sectors of the economy. And I think we need to be very open-minded about this in terms of preventing the scenario where we're going to have a number of sectors of the economy that are at risk of going from a temporary impairment to a permanent impairment. And that, I think, will be problematic for the future sustenance of the economy, even after the COVID-19 is over and done with. So if we wanted to take a view on helping out these sectors that are going to be needing support, we may want to get on this scenario planning where 40% of the banking system actually needs to be looked at and supported and restructured. And if we were to actually proactively take that view, then the amount of support that's going to be needed for the economy so that we could actually thrive going forward, as opposed to being permanently impaired to some extent, we're looking at a possibility of needing about 4,000 trillion. So I know that sounds like a lot of money, but we are talking about a scenario where we want to actually, stand erect after the COVID-19 actually blows over. Next page. These are a number of scenarios where we might be seeing the world, going through in terms of possible consequences. Number one, next page. I'm actually quite optimistic by way of my observation and many other people's observations, in that the COVID-19 has been merciless, and it has been completely non-discriminatory in terms of how it has affected people, irrespective of their race, irrespective of their wealth, physique, fame, ethnic background, religious background, geographic background. And it's just amazing how it has actually equalized the planet, equalized humanity And that, I think, is a stark observation. And I put this in the context of how the COVID-19 has affected so many people around the world, which we never thought, who we never thought would be affected. And I think this will have, call it a not negative effect on certain attributes that would have basically affected us. We have seen rising inequality in the past many years. We've seen polarizing conversations in politics and geopolitics. People going way out to the far left and people going way out to the far right at the expense of the diminution of the center and centrality. And I think by way of the equalizing forces of COVID-19, humanity going forward is likely to see the world in a different manner. And I'm sounding somewhat hopeful here in that this, I think, will bring about more equality. This, I think, will bring about less polarization of conversations. This, I think, will bring about people as being more sensitive to what it takes to preserve the planet, sensitive to environmental, degradation, and I think people are going to be more sensitive to basically using the virtual space as opposed to the physical space. And I think policy postures around the world are going to shift in such a way that they're going to try to make sure that supply chain is going to be more diverse. It's going to be more widely distributed so that we do not depend on a particular geography for the supplies of just about everything that we consume, be it goods and services. I think to the extent that we're going to show more sensitivity to some of these attributes that I've mentioned, the world is likely to be a better place to live. And that, I think, is some possible consequence that we might be seeing in the near foreseeable future on a post-COVID-19 basis. Does that sound utopian? It may sound utopian, but I think it is not an impossibility once we've seen how COVID-19 has tremendously equalized so many parts of the global equation. Next page. And this is where I think if you put this in the context of negotiations, I've had a number of discussions in the past on trade negotiations. I've been basically making comments about how multilateralization has shifted more towards bilateralization, merely because of the empirical evidence that's been showing more and more inequality. And that, I think, has severed, people's ability to understand each other because, there's just a growing number on a relative and absolute basis of the people that are getting more and more poor, as opposed to, those that are getting, into the middle class of the society. Much less we're seeing actually more than proportional enrichment at the very top of the society, meaning people that have been rich are actually getting even much richer on a more than proportional basis. This COVID-19, I think, is likely to flatten the curve. I think it's likely to depolarize conversations, and I think it's likely to, lower inequality, and I think it's likely to basically entail a more diversified, economic modeling of the economy. One clear example is that, we've discovered that we can actually be quite efficient and effective staying at home. We can actually do a lot of work at home. This is, I think, going to entail in some sort of an impairment of the value proposition of commercial real estate. People are probably not going to see as much of a need to go to the offices, as we would have before pre-COVID-19. And that, I think, will translate to how we put values on commercial real estate. It may not be as high as it would have been pre-COVID-19. And that will only imply, I think, higher value propositions for the residential real estate space. So this is just one example of how I think business models are actually shifting because of what we have gone through in the last couple of months, if not more, and what we're likely to go through in the next few weeks, if not months. Next page. We have been burning so much carbon, okay, ever since the first industrial revolution in 1850. Humanity has burned about 1,400 gigatons of carbon. You know, until recently, we were not seeing signs of that abating at all. I was actually making a comment in a number of, contexts where, we're only likely to see, the average consumption or emission of carbon of 60 gigatons on a per annum basis, even going up in the future. And I've even been making comments about our, potential of basically violating whatever would have been agreed in the Paris Accord in terms of our need to reduce carbon emission by 2030. But as a result of COVID-19, we've seen, the skies turning bluer. We've seen the oceans turning cleaner. We've seen just about everything else with respect to the environment becoming better and cleaner. I think there's hope here for humanity to actually flatten the curve in terms of our carbon emission, and I'm quite hopeful that by way of what we've experienced, we're likely to actually be able to reduce the annual emission of carbon from 60 gigatons to a much lower number, and this will require investments in renewable energy propositions, but this will also require, I think, more and more people being sensitive to how we've actually been polluting the environment unnecessarily in the past 150 years. Next page. This is just a reflection of how much we've been actually relying on conventional wisdom for energy purposes. And I think, if we get very smart and wise about things, this curve is likely to change in colors and also in the degree of incline, if not decline. Next page. So the world has been trashing, about 5.5 million tons per day, of which Indonesia contributes to about 3 to 4% of that. It's not good, and I foresee a future where I think people are going to be much more focused in terms of recycling their garbages, and I'm foreseeing a future where Indonesia is likely to basically be throwing much less than 190,000 tons of garbage on a daily basis. And this is just sheer, observation where, we have changed our lifestyles in a semi-dramatic manner in the last few weeks just by staying home. The rate of wastage, the rate of pollution just by staying home is much less than what we would have seen by not staying home, so that we could actually go out and binge on junk food and binge on just about everything that's polluting the world. Not to say that we're not going to be able to do such things again, but I'm just laying out the point that I think we're going to be much more sensitive to the environment going forward. Next page. This is not an explanation of the equalization of humanity. This is more an explanation of, I think, the possible conundrum with respect to multilateralization. We have seen in the past 500 years scenarios of what I call Thucydides' trap. Thucydides was a general in Athens. This would have been about 2,500 years ago, who basically made a prediction that, by way of the rising power of Sparta, which, eventually became, the biggest enemy of Athens, there's likely to be a war. And we have seen in the last 500 years where one nation that would have been, dominant across the world would basically witness the rise of a second nation to the occasion, and a rise of the second nation to the level where the pre-existing dominating nation would have been at. And this basically exposes the two nations, to the risks of warfare. Fortunately, relatively, out of the 16 Thucydides traps that we've seen in the last 500 years, only 4 have resulted in wars, including the one that we've experienced in the 1940s between Japan and the U.S. and between Germany and the U.S. and the Allies in Europe. And we are seeing a tremendous rise of the influence of China onto the world. And this could be or has been viewed by a number of academicians as some sort of a Thucydidean trap. Are we likely to see this actually actualizing into some sort of a warfare in a kinetic sense, in a cyber sense, or an economic sense? We have seen, realities involving some sort of a cyber warfare between the two nations, i.e. the United States and China. China is, as of today, the second largest economy in the world at about $13 trillion. The US is still the largest at about $21 trillion. But China has exercised so much influence onto the world. And there's been, allegations by the two nations against each other with respect to their, cyber warfare in the virtual space. And there's also been allegations by the two nations in the context of, economic warfares, but will they actually lead up to a real kinetic warfare? I'm not so sure, but let's hope to God that it's not going to get to that point. But I just want to basically point out the point that if it gets to a point where it gets very pointed between these two nations, it is not unprecedented. And I do hope that, by way of COVID-19's having more of an equalizing force as opposed to a equalizing force, we're hopeful that we could actually prevent this Thucydides trap, turning out to be an actual warfare between the two largest economies in the world. Next page. So this is basically some empirical evidence in terms of how Gini ratios in many countries, be it developed and developing economies, have not actually improved. The higher the Gini coefficient ratio, the more unequal or the higher the inequality within that particular economy. So if you see the trends between 2017 and 2018, it really hasn't improved that much. Some have even exacerbated. Take a look at China. It's gone up from 46.7 to 47.9. Whereas the others, there's sort of like, not improving significantly or meaningfully. And this is going to make it tough for the world to actually multilateralize because of the inequality that it's so pervasive in each of the respective economies. I've always argued and hypothesized that inequality in an economy makes it very difficult for that particular economy to actually multilateralize with other nations because of the rising, polarization in that particular economy, and that makes it difficult to politically unite the conversation so that they could actually multilateralize. Next page. This is another attribute from a marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis of many or a number of countries, which I think makes it difficult for economies or nations to multilateralize because, one guy is coming to the table with a marginal productivity of, more than $130,000 on a per capita per year basis, whereas the other guy is coming to the table with a marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis of only $10,000. And the small guy is, immediately going to think that he's going to get ripped off by the more productive guy. And that, I think, makes, multilateralizing even more difficult. So I'm seeing some cause for concern in the future until and unless these numbers or figures actually improve in the coming years. I'm also hopeful that, by way of the equalization of, many factors in this world, by way of the COVID-19 pandemic, we could actually come to a landing where, one guy would actually be in a position to try to help out the other guy to actually move up the needle in terms of its marginal productivity on a purchasing power parity basis. Next page. So I've talked about the possible consequences in the context of somewhat of a utopian manner, where we're seeing the equalization of humanity by way of how COVID-19 has broken down the barriers of race, ethnic background, racial background, geographic background, and all that good stuff. I've talked about how actually we could end up possibly in a multilateral conundrum by way of the differential productivity within economies and nations, and by way of the inequality that is so persistent and pervasive in many economies around the world. The last bit is, I want to put this in the context of, I think, how actually many governments and economies are going through the COVID-19 and how they're actually going to end up consequently. I think it's becoming more and more apparent that in a crisis management context, be it at a local, national, or international levels, it does require decisiveness in acting or taking steps to basically contain the problem and hopefully vaccinate or cure the problem. And it also means, one's ability to actually use science and data as basis for their decision making, as opposed to using their popularity for decision making purposes. And I think once you're in the process of accumulating this data and empirical data point, you basically have to be in communication with every stakeholder on a real-time, inclusive, and transparent basis. And at the point, we're actually witnessing how actually some leaders, be it at the local, regional, or national level in many economies around the world, not pursuing this type of sequence of steps. And even some leaders of some economies have pursued the steps of likership as opposed to leadership. And this, I think, is important to underline. I think post-COVID-19, people around the world are going to be able to see that what's needed going forward is not so much with respect to likership. We are now going through that stage where we demand instant gratification by way of the number of likes we get on our Instagram post, or by way of our Facebook post, or by way of our Twitter post. And I think that's going to change. I think people who are suffering so much by way of the COVID-19 pandemic, they demand tangible and concrete results. And that doesn't necessarily mean, likership on the social media. I think it does mean actual leadership and basically taking the necessary decisive steps or action. Now, a possible intra-government scenario between the capital and the states, or the provinces, or the regencies, or the municipalities, or the cities, I think we're likely to see, on the basis of leadership, more vis-a-vis likership, we're likely to see a new breed of leaders or leadership at various levels of government and governance. And I think in the context of, take for example, fiscal allocation from the center to the cities, or the provinces, or to the states, or the regencies, and what have you, I foresee a potential future where such allocation, be it from a fiscal standpoint or other standpoint, be done on a much more objective basis, And I would even stretch it even more. It may be done on the kinds of metrics which would basically measure things that are actually going to be better for the planet. Call it, environmental friendliness. Call it, human rights, preservation, if not augmentation. Call it anything or any attribute that's going to be good for the world, for the people, and the planet. And I think that is some sort of a possible scenario that we might be foreseeing, on a post COVID-19 basis. So by way of better leadership that's coming to play as opposed to likership, you can expect, improved governance. You can expect, shifts in business models, which I've illustrated earlier, by way of people's actually being able to be as efficient, if not almost as efficient, by staying home as opposed to going to work. And I think there's going to be a much higher embrace of the virtual space. And I think, the interaction between the central and the local and the state governments would reflect upon how we can actually play a more proactive role in industrializing, so that we can have a much more diverse and much more distributed supply chain around the country and around the world, so that we do not experience the kind of supply shocks that we would have in the last couple of months. We do not, experience the kind of demand shock that we would have in the last couple of months. So in sum, I just want to basically sum up. We've seen an unprecedented health crisis. We've seen an unprecedented economic crisis, and we're proposing, in an academic sense, at least, some sort of a solution which would entail, the provision of support for social safety nets, and the provision of support for the corporates or the corporations that may be at risk of going from a temporary impairment to a permanent impairment. And this would be looked at strictly from the angle of basically making sure that our economy is going to be able to sustain on a permanent basis. And we've looked at how, all this pandemic might affect a possible utopian scenario by way of the equalization of humanity. But we might also see a scenario where it may not be as utopian as we want it to be, where there's still going to be a continuation of confusion in trying to multilateralize amongst 216 countries around the world. And this confusion is exacerbated by the continuation of inequality that permeates and, pervades in the differing economies around the world, not to mention the differential marginal productivity in those respective economies. And last but not least, we're likely to see, hopefully on a more, utopian basis, better interaction between the center and the regions for purposes of not only communication, but also for purposes of leading as opposed to embracing likership, so that we can actually better preserve the planet and also, prevent what could possibly be, a future demand shock or a supply shock. Let me pause right there and take questions.
Okay, thank you, Gita, for the explanation. Before we move on, I'd like to ask or clarify something, Gita. So you mentioned that there is most likely going to be a kind of reorientation of how people will negotiate. What?
Sorry, I lost you. I think you got cut off.
Could you hear me now, Pak?
Yeah, I could. Could you repeat the last sentence? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a big possibility that there will be a reorientation of how governments will negotiate with each other and within themselves. And how do you see it right now in Indonesia? Because as we have heard in the news and read in the newspapers, that there seems to be less synchronized decisions from the central government and the local governments. What do you think is the bottleneck in negotiation in that sense?
Well, I think the lack of perceived synchronicity or synchronization of communication between the center and some regional governments is merely a reflection of a number of things. Number one, it's a reflection of the sheer lack of communication between the center and the regional governments, be it at the city level or at the provincial level or at the regency level, right? And to be fair to the center, I think the center, is inundated with, the shock of information and the shock of issues and problems to deal with, right? So number one, it's the lack of communication, which I think to some extent explains the lack of seeming synchronization of the conversation. And second, I think it's basically attributable to the differential proactivity at the regional levels. I'm actually quite encouraged by the fact that some regional leaderships have shown proactivity in stepping up even before they were told by the central government, right? And I think the steps that they would have taken are a reflection of their being sensitive, meaning the steps that would have been taken by the regional leaders are actually a reflection of their sensitivity towards the needs of the stakeholders or their populace, but also a reflection of their capacity, right? And I think this is what I was trying to mean by, the journey from likership to leadership, right? And I think people are gonna hopefully get more rational going forward in demanding, or at least hoping for, the type of leadership that actually, not only listens to the people, but also, understands in terms of what it takes to provide for the people, not only in good times, not only in normal times, but also in bad times. And I think those two, I think, are possible explanations for why we might not be seeing some sort of a synchronization of communication. And this is not unique, okay? We're seeing this in the United States, okay? Some governors are saying things that are completely opposite to what the national government is saying, and they're doing completely opposite to whatever the national government is saying. Some necessarily better, some not necessarily better.
Okay, yeah, I just heard yesterday that one governor said that the administration is trying to pass the buck without passing the bucks. So that's probably one example of the not synchronized way of how they're taking decisions.
Right. Look, I mean, there is an element of politics also in this, right? And when somebody's in politics, it's all about, maximizing the upside and minimizing the downside, whatever it takes, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to basically take credit for the gain and not take credit for the pain.
Got it. Okay, Pak Gita, there's one question from Mbak Puri Lestari. So I'm going to give her the chance to ask directly. Mbak Puri, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Pak Fendri.
Okay,
I
go
was
ahead.
quite surprised, actually. So thank you for the opportunity. And Pak Gita, good morning, and thank you so much for the presentation and the insights that we all shared today, this morning. I was just watching a program by ABC Australia last night on YouTube, actually. The title is The Cost of Coronavirus,
Right.
I think, if I'm not mistaken. And it's very interesting because it tells the story behind how Australia come about to roll out policy for the stimulus packages. They rolled out 3 packages already. Phase 1 is for the health system, which is about 40 billions. The second is to securing the households through Centrelink, which is about 70 billions. And the last one, the biggest chunk, is 130 billions. And in total, they account to 10% of debt to GDP ratio. And what's really interesting is the show tells a story how the federal responded to COVID. And then there was a little bit of tension with the local government as well with the premiers of New South Wales and Victoria. And it shows the dynamics of the federal and the local state or the state government, which also you touched a little bit before. But then in the end, it really shows the story how they come about to get together and just, providing for the best interest of the nation. So I think it's a wonderful story of negotiation and pulling through together. And I was wondering, my question to you is, what is your opinion of the tri-sector response happening in Indonesia right now? Because as we see in the ABC story, it shows how labor unions also put their interest and lobbying, effort in making sure the narrative changed. So to push forward the 130 billions to make sure the businesses are securing jobs for the employees. So I guess my question is, what's your opinion of the tri-sector collaboration happening right now in Indonesia? And the second is, how might we act together to bridge this kind of conversation happening in Indonesia? I guess beyond the political power play, if that such a thing exists in Indonesia right now. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
What do you mean by the tri-sector? Meaning the state and the center and the labor? Is that what you meant?
Meaning government, businesses, and civil society.
Okay, all right. Look, what I try to make a point of earlier is that as much as people differ in their views on just about everything or anything, I think COVID-19 on a net basis has united and unified almost everyone. That there is a real danger. There is a real health danger, if not crisis, okay? And this is, I think, reflected in how just about everybody in town has experienced somebody's death within 2 degrees of freedom, okay? It could be your immediate relative, it could be a relative of your relative, it could be a friend of your relative, it could be your immediate friend, or it could be a friend of your friend, it could be your colleague, or it could be a friend of your colleague. So at the very least, within 2 degrees, or at the very most, within 2 degrees of freedom, you're experiencing a tragedy. And this, I think, on a net basis has brought about unity and unification. And this, I think, makes it easier for civil society and the government and the business community to agree onto something. I'm not suggesting that this could be done, instantaneously and easily. There's usually ego, and there's usually differential aspirations by each of the 3 stakeholders, but I think it's a lot more possible right now to undertake some sort of a collective action. I can tell you, I started, voicing the numbers, in terms of what ought to be done to basically provide support for, liquidity purposes, for social safety net purposes, and potentially for the corporates to stay afloat, so that we could actually have sustenance of the economy post COVID-19. A couple of months ago, this was scoffed at and laughed at and met with ridicule and skepticism. But I think at the rate that people are actually coming to the recognition that there's no other way, as much as we want to get money from the domestic markets, there's no way we're going to be able to get whatever we're going to need from the domestic markets. There's not likely to be a way or an easy way to get, whatever we're going to need from the international markets. I can't see any other way but to basically quantitatively ease the economy or monetize the fiscal space, i.e., in a very crude sense, print money. And I'm not suggesting that this is my top of favorites. It's been against my belief earlier on. It's been against the belief of many people. But as of late, I think more and more people within academic domain and within the regulatory and political domain are getting it. That this is seemingly the only way to do it. So I think it's going to boil down to a unity and unification of concept amongst those three stakeholders in the context of what I'm proposing. But it could boil down to some differential views in terms of the amounts, in terms of the execution. I mean, I'm okay with that. If there's a difference in terms of how we execute it, in terms of the amount with which we're going to go ahead with it, I'm okay with that, as long as there is a collective understanding that there is a great degree of crisis at stake, and it takes a collective effort to, remedy it. So I've tried to answer your two questions and one explanation. In a nutshell, I think in Indonesia, as much as there's differential political, views and aspirations, I think we're likely to become more collective than in recent times than ever. So there's hope here, and I just want to stress that this is of great magnitude, the problem, and this requires decisive steps.
Yep, agree, Pak. So thank you so much for your time and the explanation. Very well taken. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you.
Pak Fendri, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mbak Puri. Thank you, Pak Gita. Mbak Puri is Pak Agus's daughter, Pak Gita.
Oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right.
So the next questioner is from our student from batch 5, Mbak Sasti. Go ahead, Mbak Sasti.
Thank you, Pak Fendri. Good morning, Pak Gita.
Morning.
I think because today you mentioned about the climate crisis and the carbon, since my questions is actually have a correlations with that issue. Tomorrow is a Mother Earth Day, and some of the news say that the COVID-19 will be a silver lining for the climate, but the UN shifts on the environment sector said that it is not a silver lining for the climate. What do you think? I would like to ask you, what is your opinions regarding to these issues of COVID-19 and climate crisis? And also for the post-COVID-19, is it a golden moment to voicing the renewable energy business? And in the fact of importance of Paris agreements on climate crisis? Thank you, Pak Gita.
Look, I think now there's more hope in fulfilling the aspirations of the Paris Accord by 2030. I personally can say for myself that, I probably don't have to go to the office as often, as much as I used to in the past. I can be quite productive at home, right? So every minute, every hour, every day I don't go to the office, that means less emission of carbon, right? Not to say that I can't walk to the office. I mean, I can certainly do that, but just on the basis of my staying home, and I can say quite comfortably that I think there's a lot of people who sense the same type of sentiment. That I think is going to bring about actual declination of emission of carbon, and that I think is gonna, without being imposed upon by any government, that's going to bring about more friendliness towards the environment, and I think a better chance of fulfilling the aspirations of the Paris Accord by 2030. Now, with regards to renewable energy, implementation, I think there's still a challenge. I've been talking about this, in a number of occasions, in terms of the tariff structure for, let's say, geothermal or for solar capabilities. I think there need to be not only studies. I think there's probably more studies than needed, but there needs to be decisive action to basically assert that renewable energy is going to be net good for the people. I don't see prospect of anybody making money in renewable energy if they can only charge 6, 7, or 8 cents per kilowatt. It's very clear empirically that they need to be charging more than that in order for them to actually be able to be commercially viable. So if you want to encourage the business to be commercially unviable, the way to do it is to maintain whatever we've been doing, and you're not likely to see any robust development from an energy production standpoint in the context of renewable energy. But I do foresee a future where, I think the government is going to realize, we can't continue doing, the old business, the old paradigm, all the time. I think we've got to rejig it. Otherwise, we're just going to look so unique, in front of our electorates. I think it's going to get down to that point. So, and I think fundamentally it relates to the earlier point I was making. Do you want to actually be, you want to get likes on your posting, or you want to actually, show that you can actually produce something that's going to be good in the long run for the people? I choose the latter. So I think that's a possibility.
Thank you, Pak Gita.
Thank you, Pak. This is the first time that we're live streaming on YouTube, Pak. And there's a question from Susanti Liu from the comments on YouTube. What do you think that our government is basing their decisions? Is it based on political purpose or humanity? This is probably quite a tough question. So,
look, clearly it's based on humanity. Okay, I think there's a recognition by everybody, including those in the government, actually more so in the government than anything, that there is a real crisis. Let's not forget, people in the government, they have relatives, they have friends outside the government that might have been, affected by the COVID-19. And this is, heartening on just about everyone, including all of us here. I know, and I can stress that there's a recognition that things ought to be done, for humanity's purposes. But it doesn't necessarily discount, the politics within the equation. And I think the politics is more relevant to their need to communicate with, each other, be it, between the executive branch of the government and the legislative branch of the government, or even within the legislative branch of the government, amongst the different colors of the parties. But I say this again, I think there is net more commonality than differences amongst them. Yes, we've heard sound bites about, some people wanting to do this that would be contrary to the spirit of the Perpu that would have been issued some weeks ago. But, I think the Perpu was a beautiful piece in that, it basically set the foundation, and it basically set the legal, groundwork for anything to be done decisively for the purposes of humanity. So at the end of the day, it's really the steps that have been taken by the government and the steps that are to be taken by the government that will basically make sure that humanity will be preserved, hopefully enhanced going forward. Will there be a delay in execution? There is a delay already, and that delay, I think, is not a reflection of the lack for care for humanity. I think that's a lack of, like you suggested earlier, perhaps the lack of synchronization of conversations. But that's part of the process, I think.
Okay, thank you, Pak. So the next questioner is from our student from batch 6, Pak Gita. Mas Jeffy, go ahead, Mas Jeffy.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Henry. Well, good to see you again, Pak Gita. Thank you so much for your beautiful insight. This is me, Jeff.
Okay.
So basically, Pak Gita, because and we
Sorry, you're breaking
down.
off there.
So
can you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah. Because right now we are facing a contraction, and GDP is going down right now. So there are fiscal policy and monetary policy that being conducted by government, such as increasing taxes, reducing consumption, reducing expenditure, and then for the monetary side, government also increasing interest rate and government selling bonds. So my question is, beside those kind of monetary and fiscal policy that I mentioned before, do you think that government policy about this fiscal and monetary policy during COVID-19 outbreak is already effective enough to our country? And that is my first question. And for the second question is, right now, all of the stock market is going down. So in your perspective of thinking, so what actually government can do to give the stimulus to the stock market, so that the stock market will rise again, and the people would be more passionate in stock market? So that is my question. If I can ask one more question, it would be good, Pak Gita. But
Sure, fire away.
Yeah. Okay. My third question is, you said you have said before that the policy for the next 6 months, like number one is pendapatan tenaga kerja for 600 trillion, and then fasilitas kesehatan dan sosial 400 trillion, pemulihan ekonomi nasional UMKM 200 trillion. So my question is, what
Sorry, you broke off on the last part.
running for more than 6 months? Let's say perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I get it.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Gita and Friendly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's safe to assume that the amount that was announced by the government is not enough. Okay. The 405 trillion rupees represents only 2.6% of the GDP. It's just not enough if we want to be able to survive through the crises and get out healthily. And what I mean by healthily is that from an economic standpoint, we are, a lot of us are limping right now in the real sector. And while we're limping, if we're not getting the medication, there's a risk of that limp basically turning into a paralysis. And once paralysis kicks in, if I were a runner that's up for the Olympics, which would have been this year but delayed until next year, I'm not going to be able to run, much less walk, much less move out of my chair or bed if I'm not being medicated. So you saw in the earlier pages, okay, the amount or the number of tests that are being done on a 1 million basis is only 150, where we know other countries that have shown to actually be able to flatten the curve are doing about 10,000 tests on a per 1 million basis. So we can do the math here in terms of increasing that 150 to 10,000, it's going to require a lot of money. Not to mention the medication that's needed, the vitamins that are needed, the beds that are needed, the doctors and the nurses, and not to mention the ventilators that are needed, the hydroxychloroquine or anything else that's needed to medicate, these people. If the millions of people that are, barbers at barbershops, that are therapists, that are actors in the creative industry, that are working in the factories, that are, transporting people in motorcycles, none of these guys have any economic activity. The barbers are not barbing hair. The actors are not acting. The musicians are not performing. The factory workers are not working. This is in the millions. If they do not get compensated, and as much as you want, someone else to compensate them, the only guy that can play the more proactive role of compensating these guys is the government. I don't see the barber asking his brother to compensate him. I don't see the actor asking his sister to compensate him. I don't see the musician asking her brother to compensate him. The only way is to make sure that, these guys get compensated. Now, to the extent that they don't get compensated, there could be, social instability. And that, I think, is an undesired form by anybody, particularly the government. So we've done the numbers. It's about 100 trillions per month. So if we want to prepare for 6 months, it's going to amount to 600 trillions. Now, if we get over the hurdle in less than 6 months, great. Then we're not going to need all 600 trillions. But we need to allocate that much so that we can actually prepare. Now, your last question was with respect to whether we're going to need more if this goes on for longer than 6 months. Absolutely. Is there a risk of this actually occurring or happening or developing longer than 6 months? At this moment, I don't have any confidence anywhere as to whether or not we can actually nip it in the bud in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, or 6 months, just because of the uncertainties that we're seeing. I think once we do the testing enough, only then empirically we can tell ourselves that we have done enough testing as to be able to predict that we're going to be able to flatten the curve in the next 4 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or 5 months. Before then, we can't say whether it's going to last 6 months or more or less. But if it does lapse, if it does take place longer than 6 months, then I think we've got to do more, liquidity support for the millions of people that are exposed. Now, your first question was with respect to a combination of fiscal policy and monetary policy. Just to be clear, across the world, monetary policy makers have actually been reducing interest rates. Indonesia has clearly been reducing interest rates, okay? The risk-free rate, which is pertinent to the SBI, Certificat Bank Indonesia, is at the moment 4.5%, which is tremendously lower than what it would have been 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. That's actually very encouraging. And is the central bank likely to actually further reduce that? Yes, I can say that with unequivocality or confidence. And not only will they actually consider lowering it from 4.5% to, I don't know, it could be to 4.25 or 4% by 25 to 50 basis points, but they could also consider doing other things. The Perpu basically has addressed the possibility that the central bank or Bank Indonesia could actually go into the primary markets for buying new bond issuances by the Ministry of Finance. I think this is a rare opportunity for both the central bank or Bank Indonesia and the Ministry of Finance to work together collaboratively so that, one institution issues the bonds and the other buys the bonds so that not only will it be able to create liquidity for the economy, but they can actually reset the interest rate, meaning even lower than what it would have been. The Surat Utang Negara, or SUN, that was auctioned off some time ago would have been at about 7%-ish. This could be an opportunity for them to actually reset it or recalibrate it down to a lower level than 7%. So I think there's opportunities here to actually help, not only in terms of providing social safety nets, but again, I stress the corporations. If the corporations are not supported sequentially after the social safety nets, the economy is at risk because they employ millions of people and they are clients of the banking system. And if the banking system is not getting the interest income that they're supposed to be getting from their clients, then we run the risk of the banking system running into liquidity crisis, a loan, contraction risk. And that's not good because the banking system is the preeminent and most dominant support for our economy. So I've done the numbers on the earlier page that, on the assumption that 40% of the balance sheet of the bank runs the risk of shifting from temporary impairment to permanent employment, to permanent impairment. Oh boy, then it's going to be really dire, the economic consequences for our country. I do think they need to be helped out, but not necessarily right now. I think right now what is really important is the social safety nets for the millions of people and the healthcare facilities that need to be prepared.
Okay, thank you, Pak Gita.
And question number 2, Pak Gita. Right now, all of the stock market is going down. So, in your perspective of thinking,
okay, let me clarify.
Actually, government can
I'm
do.
Not, yeah, I forgot to address that. I'm not a believer that the stock market is an indicator of an economy. Okay, I would actually leave that for last. We can go by, the references of the United States capital markets. Okay, the Fed, the central bank of the United States government, has basically done, $2.5 trillion of quantitative easing or printing money. And with whatever money they've printed, they've been buying the treasury bills, the treasury notes, they've been buying corporate bonds. Lately, they've actually been buying high yield bonds. High yield bonds are actually bonds that are rated below investment grade. These are relatively lower quality bonds. So it shows their aggressive nature in terms of supporting the capital markets from a debt market standpoint. Now there's indication that they might go into the stock market and buy stocks just for the purposes of propping up, the stock market. That's not necessarily healthy. That's almost exactly what happened in 2008 when they supported the capital markets. And that's exactly, what happened in 2008, 2009 was that the liquidity support from the Fed primarily went to Wall Street as opposed to Main Street. And that actually caused a lot of resentment in the Rust Belt states, in the states in the United States where there's lots of factories, lots of people that lost jobs because the Main Street was not getting the money. So I would actually focus on providing liquidity support for Main Street as opposed to Wall Street, where in this case in Indonesia it's the capital market that is Wall Street. I would worry about that later, if not last. I would worry more about social safety nets, and then I would worry later on about the companies that are actually involved in basically creating jobs in the real sector. Let's not forget, okay, 1,650 hotels have been closed down, and thousands of restaurants have been closed down. Okay, and if I always get asked, what's the easiest industry you want to be in? You want to be in a hospitality industry because it is the easiest and cheapest to create a job. But people forget the opposite side of the equation. It's also the easiest to lose a job when a pandemic occurs, right? Because people don't go out to eat. So there's a study that says that it costs about $3,000 to $4,000 to create one job in a hospitality space, in the tourism space, whereas in a manufacturing space, it costs about $150,000 to create one job. So if you're an economy with 265 million people, you want to make sure that as many people as possible have jobs. So you want to focus on the tourism sector. You want to focus on the hospitality sector. Lots of people have been affected negatively by the COVID-19, and these are the guys that we have to help out. Then, of course, the people that are working as small, medium entrepreneurs, who sell, ayam goreng, who sell kain, on the sides of the streets. These guys, they don't have customers, nor do they have, the supply of the goods that they need to sell. They need to be helped out. If they don't get helped out, then there is social instability. So if this gets taken care of, the social safety nets, and if the corporations that have, labor intensiveness, then I think the stock markets will get taken care of automatically, because the perception of how the economy is actually going to be able to rebound is going to dovetail in a positive manner with respect to the capital markets.
Okay, thank you, Pak Gita. Jeff, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, Pak Gita and Pak Fendry.
Okay, so next we have a question from one of the participants, Pak Gita, the attendees. To what extent do you think the media framing has affected the economy in the world in general and Indonesia in particular? Both the framing of Indonesian media and international media, even the WHO media itself.
Look, I've been saying there's three types of shocks that we all have gone through, or we're all going through. The first type of shock is the shock of over-information. Okay, everybody is getting over-information from anything, any type of communication or information. We're getting it from our WhatsApp, SMSs, social media, mainstream media, and non-mainstream media. Okay. And we're getting even WhatsApp from our relatives and friends about what to do, whether we wash our hands this way or we wash our hands that way. This is causing anxiety, okay? And let me try to broadly explain this, more broadly than just, how the media has actually, distorted a lot of information. The second type of shock is basically the shock upon our lifestyle. We have shifted from a much more physical and communal type of lifestyle to a much more virtual and a much less communal type of lifestyle. And this, I think, has shocked a lot of us, but at the rate that we've been staying at home for the last 3 weeks, we've kind of gotten used to it. We know how to be productive by staying at home, and we know how to be efficient and effective by staying at home. Some may not be able to survive this change in lifestyle as well as some others or many others, but this shock is permeating in a big way. And the third type of shock is basically the shock of policy responses that are coming from various directions and at multiple times and different times of the day. It could come from your RT, RW, Lurah, Camat, Wali Kota, Bupati, and governor, and ministers, and president, or prime minister, and leaderships of different countries around the world, which you watch over, be it on your handphone or on your TV. It's a shock that we have never experienced before. So, but what I can hypothesize is that I think people have learned to adapt to the new way of living, okay, by way of the three shocks that we've gone through. And the adaptation, I think, has involved our sheer ability to vet through so much information that's been going through the different channels of communication and information. So what that means is that I think it has educated many of us, most of us, if not all of us, to actually be able to vet through, whatever comes out of the media. I'm not suggesting nor generalizing that everybody's been able to do it, but I think in most cases, people have been able to actually vet through for the benefit of themselves. And I think what's good about it is that people are actually staying at home and they can actually make decisions that's good for themselves at home. So I think it would be more risky if they were exposed to information that's coming from different angles, be it the mainstream media or the non-mainstream media. It would be more risky if this person has received that information from the media and actually goes out and leaves the home and interacts with others. That I think is more risky. So in a sense, there is an inherent mitigation of the risk of distortion with respect to information coming from any sorts of media.
Got it. Thank you, Pa. So I'd just like to go quickly to the question from our YouTube stream. The first one I think you've already answered, in which Twin Kitchen asked about how long do you think the COVID crisis is going to last? This I think you've answered in a previous question. And the second question is from Adi Pratama, which is also asking in our attendees question and answer box here. What are the main drivers of the argument that post-COVID will lead to declining of inequality?
Look, I can say that by way of how we have changed our behavior with respect to COVID-19, I can say for myself, I can say for my family, I think we're net positive citizens of the world as opposed to how we would have been 2 to 3 months ago, pre-COVID-19. Okay, we're eating more carefully. We've become more hygienic. We are engaging in more positive conversations as to reflect upon our sensitivity with respect to the environment, the planet, and all this on the back of how we are going through the experience of somebody's dying who could have been the most famous person on earth, the most physically athletic person on the planet, the most wealthy person on the planet, the most, you name it, from all kinds of attributes. Okay, and these attributes, in some sense, in the past, have reflected upon forces that push the boundaries of equality, so that humanity had become more unequal than we would have hoped for. As a result of the sensitivity and recognition, I'm hopeful. I'm not saying for certain, I'm hopeful that once we get out of this cave, call it COVID-19, I think when we sit down in the office, or when we sit down in the car, or when we sit down with anybody who could be a politician, who could be a policy maker, who could be a religious leader, who could be a community leader, who could be, in a position of leadership of just about anything, you name it, they're not going to easily forget what we would have gone through in the last couple of months. Okay, it's important to note, okay, if, let's try to go forward 20 to 30 years from today, okay, when we all become fathers, grandfathers, or grandmothers, or mothers, or grandfather, we would be telling the story to our children, grandchildren, and grandchildren that we survived this war by staying at home and staying in bed, as opposed to we survived this war by actually picking up our gun and knives and bayonets to basically try to kill off our enemies. That, I think, is a reckoning. So I'm hopeful again that this will bring about better recognition for doing things that will bring about less inequality. I don't know. That's all I could say.
Thank you, Pak Gita. We have a couple of questions more, Pak Gita, from YouTube and also from our students here. Hopefully, we'll have time to get through all of them. The next question is from Feli Ismail. She's our student from batch 4. She would like to ask your opinion in the context of the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19. As the Economist mentioned, there is a growing opinion that China will be the winner from this catastrophe, and looking at how the current US president approaches the problem, including his intention to defund the IMF, it's a warning that the pandemic will be remembered not only as a human disaster, but also as a geopolitical turning point away from America. What is your opinion on this matter? And regarding the US presidential race and the geopolitical context, what does the future hold if Trump wins the race, or if Biden wins the race?
Look, I think the question would have referred to the potential defunding of the WHO, not the IMF.
Ah, yeah.
But on that basis, let me say the following. Okay, China has shown to be able to flatten the curve earlier than anybody else. I think on the basis that they were the first to experience the pandemic, and they actually were able to adapt to the situation much more quickly, much earlier than anybody else. And they've shown to be able to flatten the curve. But I think we have to be sensitive to, whether or not the numbers that would have been reported by China truly reflect the actual casualties in China. Okay, and there's been a lot of discussions about this. But assuming the accuracy of the data points that would have been reported by China, then I would go into the discussion of how China is actually positioned economically vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Okay, they've shown to the rest of the world that they can be, or they could be, the largest factory of the world. Okay, to the point even us, or we, depend. Everybody around the world depends on China's factories. Okay, 80% of the goods and services sold at every mall, around the world, at Walmart, at Amazon.com, it's all made in China. 80% of the pharmaceutical goods that's consumed by everybody around the world is made in China, directly or indirectly. Some would argue that there's a huge pharmaceutical capability in India. But people don't recognize that, some of the elements of the pharmaceutical supply chain in India actually still come from China. So the dependence upon China is so significant that we cannot live without China in the near foreseeable future. But economically speaking, China runs on a bank loan to GDP ratio of more than 300%. Okay, and China has been running on a fiscal deficit of, arguably between 4 to 5%. These numbers are actually higher than Indonesia's numbers. They're actually higher than the numbers of the United States in terms of percentages and ratios. And China also ran for the first time after 25 to 30 years into a current account deficit last year. So now, by way of the slowing down of the production capabilities in China because of the supply shock and people not being able to go back to the factories, and also slowing demand in many parts of the world, so there's likely to be a slowing down of the economy in China. Okay. Now, when we want to talk about geopolitics, you have to actually be able to measure the strength of one country's economy as to actually be able to influence the geopolitics of the world. So I foresee a situation where China has become levered up so significantly, right, at more than 300% bank loan to GDP ratio, a fiscal deficit and a current deficit. And I think this year they're likely to go through another current deficit scenario because demand is shrinking for their goods and services, and their production is also, slowing down a little bit. Not to mention, their currency. Their currency only represents, around 2% of the global cross-border transactions. Okay, it's not as popular as they want it to be yet. It's not as popular as the US dollar and the euro as currencies of the world. People now still want to transact internationally in the US dollars or euros. The rest in pounds and yen, Swiss francs, and all that good stuff. So it depends on how China is going to be able to remold their leverage to a better situation, bringing down from above 300% bank loan to GDP to less than 300%, and remold China's economic structure so that they don't run into a current account deficit again. They don't run into as much a fiscal deficit as they've gone through. And they can further popularize the renminbi to a level well above 2%. And let's not forget, they're a closed capital account, okay? So you have to put all that in the context of how the geopolitics of the world is going to play out. The US is economically challenged, okay? But the US has got a few things that I think could, favor their economy, perhaps a little bit more than China. The US has energy, okay? Access of energy. And the US has demographics, okay? When you look at demographics, you start thinking of productivity, because the younger the population, then the more productive they get to be. And the last bit is that they've got innovation. And a good chunk of the innovativeness of the world is coming out of Silicon Valley. So you have to take into account those attributes also. So will this result in an immediate rechanging or an immediate changing of the geopolitical equation? I'm not so sure, okay? I think if there were any geopolitical reorientation or geopolitical change in terms of who gets to be stronger than whom, it's going to take time. I don't think it's going to be instantaneous in the sense that it's going to take place immediately after COVID-19 is over and done with. So you have to actually size up as to how long these two largest economies are going to be able to survive the storm. And I think that is a debate or a discussion that's going to take a long time. So in some, it's not going to be instantaneous. It's going to take a long time for the geopolitical equation to change.
Thank you, Pak Gita. Next, we have a couple of more questions, Pak Gita. 3-4 more questions. Sure. And the next question is from Yansha. Go ahead, Mas Yansha. He's a student from batch 2, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, Mas Yansha, go ahead.
Mas Fenry, Pak Gita, thank you for your time. My question is, we're looking at the amidst the COVID-19, we're looking at the oil prices going down to an extreme low, even in probably the lowest in history. And for the Indonesian side, some of the contractors, oil and gas contractors, KKS, has been proposing for force majeure to stopping their field works. And this is affecting the oil and gas production, and also implies to the vendors, subcontractors, and many parts of Indonesian companies related to the oil and gas industry. So what I'm asking is, what policy do you think will need to be taken by the government, and whether Indonesia can maintain its energy sufficiency if the scenario of this COVID-19 will endure to the end of this year, for example? What do you think about that, Pagita? Thank you very much for your time.
Look, I mean, we've been running on a daily consumption of 1.6 million barrels, right? Until before COVID-19 started, right? I think it's safe to assume, by way of the drop or significant drop of aggregate demand, that number is going to come down, right? From 1.6 to a much lower number, right? This drop in aggregate demand has, as you pointed out, translated into a drop of oil price in a significant manner, and this has created not only opportunities but opportunism amongst many capable or financially capable countries, right? Which I'm not going to mention the names of. So they've been basically buying more than usual amounts of oil. Now, in the context of whether or not, the COVID-19 serves as a force majeure for oil and gas companies or oil and gas related companies in Indonesia, if this were to, like you said, last until the end of the year, I'm not so sure yet if we can actually use this as a force majeure, so that companies do not necessarily have to fulfill their contractual obligations with their counterparties. I'm not so sure yet. But I know this: there are companies that are already doing that. I mean, on the back of claiming that this is a force majeure that could be used as for anybody not to fulfill their contractual obligation. So I think what's going to happen is that if this thing persists, in that more and more companies are going to claim force majeure so that they don't have to fulfill their contractual obligations, this could end up in a game of legal interpretations, right? Even if it's not clearly stipulated in their contracts, in that a pandemic would actually be construed as a force majeure, I think companies are going to hire the best lawyers in town so that they get the necessary favorable interpretation for their own sake. I think we might foresee that sort of a stage or a phase where companies are just going to go ahead and claim force majeure so that they don't have to fulfill their contractual obligations. Not because they want to be cute about it, but it's more because of the liquidity stresses that they're going through. And as I've illustrated earlier, more and more companies are going through the liquidity stress. Now, am I pessimistic as to think that the oil price is going to hover at less than $10 per barrel for a long time? No. I think it's going to rebound on the back of two things. Number one, I'm seeing opportunism as it relates to some countries that are actually buying more than usual so that they could stockpile. And number two, I'm also seeing some countries already being able to flatten the curve so that they could actually re-pick up the lost aggregate demand. So whenever a country or an economy re-picks up its lost aggregate demand, the demand is usually for energy and everything else, right? So that incremental demand is going to translate to a recalibration or an upward recalibration of the oil price, which would mean a renormalization of the oil and gas industry, which would mean that the possibility of anybody's claiming force majeure would be diminished. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Okay. Do you see that the energy sufficiency in Indonesia then will be okay, positive?
No, that's not what I was saying. I mean, there is a temporary decline in demand, and the supply for oil is what the lifting or the production on a daily basis is at around 700 to 800,000 barrels. So the delta between 1.6 or whatever it is after it drops from 1.6 is still quite significant between that level and the production. So we still have to import. So the good news is that we can import as much as we want to right now because it's so cheap, but it requires money, right? And the oil and gas players and the fiscal space of this country or of this government is under stress, right? So at the rate that the oil and gas company of the country and the fiscal space of the country are under stress, so there's limitation in terms of being able to buy, oil as much as we need. So will it lead to a self-sufficient type of situation from an oil and gas, from an oil standpoint? No, not in the near future.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bapak. Thank you, Mas Yansyah, for the question. Pak Gita, I'd like to take one question from YouTube and then one more question from the Q&A section.
Sure.
So from YouTube, Angki Banggaditya asks, Dear Pak Gita, if you were the president of Indonesia, what would you do first once the COVID-19 pandemic is over? What do you think is the most crucial measure that needs to be taken by the government?
Well, that's a purely imaginary question. I think anybody that gets to be in a position of leadership should tackle this predominantly as a health issue, right? Before it is an economic issue. And I'll say this again, we're implementing a lockdown policy on our community more based on intuition as opposed to empirical evidence that would suggest, the degree of transmission, right? And is that policy necessarily correct? I think net it is correct, even though it is based on intuition more than empirical evidence, right? The empirical evidence is where we actually need to do a lot more massive testing, okay? At the rate that we've only tested around 40,000, we've gotten delivery of, I think, more than 100,000 testing devices, but we've only tested around 40,000 in the whole country. That gives us a testing of about 150 per 1 million. That's not enough, okay? Very simply put. We need to ramp that up. And only at a point where we could actually be testing about 10,000 people on a per 1 million basis would we be able to actually, within some margin of error, ascertain the degree of transmission in any zip code of the country. And we've got to do it massively from Sabang to Merauke, okay? So that we can actually pinpoint where the degree of transmission is significant enough so that we can actually do a more stringent, if not draconian, lockdown policy. And where in places where we do not have any transmission, where we do not have, any significant transmission, that's a place where we could actually re-engage in economic activities without physical distancing, right? And that actually allows for, the economic recovery to take place in a more sustained basis. So after we do the health, centric phase, then we can, almost simultaneously look after those people that would have been severely affected by the COVID-19 I'll say again, the barbers, the actors, the singers, the therapists, the ojek drivers, the baristas, and the people that would have been able to earn and make a living but can't make a living, they need to be taken care of almost immediately. If they do not get taken care of, then I think we're looking at, we're running the risk of potential social instability. So I think the concern with any leadership around the world is that he or she may underwrite the risk of underestimating the problem, right? And I think underwriting the risk of underestimating problems is a classic cause for concern with respect to any leadership. So last but not least, I think you've got to basically be able to communicate in a real-time manner, in a transparent manner, in an inclusive manner with all the stakeholders, be it the academicians, the economists, the politicians, the religious leaders, the civil society members, so that you can actually concoct some sort of a construct that is comprehensive, not only in terms of amount that's needed, but also in terms of how you can layer the solution with respect to everybody. And I think, as much as I want to treat the earlier page of 4,000 trillion rupees, as an academic discussion point, but I think it illustrates the realistic nature with which, you've got to basically try to nip it in the bud. And it basically relates to very simply the amount that's needed for providing social safety nets for millions of people that don't have any income, and millions of people that are actually working at corporations or not factories that are likely not able to pay payroll, not able to pay their installments to the banks because they cannot function because of the physical distancing policies. So yeah, I think those are, I think, the rudimentary steps that ought to be taken by any leadership anywhere.
Thank you, Pak. So last, I'm going to go to the question and answer session for the attendees. Yeah. There are 3 questions here, but I think some of them are related with each other. The first one is from Muhammad Yasir Fatin Shah. He's asking, in your perspective, does the regional interconnection or connectivity cooperation, is it still important in order to recover the state economy compared with the self-recovering by each state? Okay. And the second question is about, this is probably related a bit, about mudik, Pak. So yep. The president has banned mudik, and what do you think about it? How do you think the Indonesian government is doing so far in terms of preventing explosion of the number of positive cases in Indonesia?
Look, I mean, it's important to note that one's well-being is of the most paramount importance, right? And for anybody to think that he or she could stay safely while undertaking the annual migration, or call it mudik, that I think is a false presumption, right? That is, I think, a misplaced way of looking after one's health, right? If you go on this annual migration or mudik, you're going to be sitting next to so many people in an angkot or on a motorcycle, in a bus, on a train, on an airplane. That only underwrites, that only underlines my earlier point of underwriting the risk of underestimating the health risk, right? And if we don't take measures to prevent that from happening, we're not showing moral nor any kind of responsibilities for the people. I'm hugely supportive of the policy of basically preventing as many people as possible from going back to their homes for this annual migration purpose. And mudik, I think, is too much of a risk to take for anybody in Indonesia at the moment, unless we already have the vaccines, unless we've already figured out the denominator, unless we've already figured out how to actually cure ourselves, in some fashion. But believing that, the act of going back to the village to see our family members is of more paramount importance than believing in one's health, I think that's a misplaced conception. So that's the answer to the second question. Now, with respect to the first question, I say this again, I'm seeing pulses in the regions at the city level and at the kabupaten level, at the provincial level, where the leaderships over there are showing proactivity for the purpose of saving their population from, or preventing the population from being exposed to unnecessary risks or unnecessary health risks. And that, I think, is a good thing. And that, I think, is a sign of leadership, as opposed to, some leaders, just being or getting busy with, whether or not they're going to get liked on their posting on the social media. That, I think, will be more appreciated in the long run by the people. Now, in terms of, my being hopeful on a much more synchronized, communication between the center and the regions, I am actually hopeful that this is actually going to get better. And I think people will see it when the stimulus package, arrives at somebody's home in the remote areas of Indonesia. That's got to do with the proactivity of the center and also the proactivity of the region. Okay, so the proactivity at both levels, not only will it reflect upon the synchronization of the communication, but I think it will actually be reflected in the appreciation by the people who have actually been beneficiary of the support from the government. When that beneficiary of support feels hugely gratified, it's only going to reinforce the need for a much more synchronized communication between the center and the regions. Look, I want to take this opportunity to address a question that's been asked to me many times in the past. People would always ask, as to what's going to happen with the rupiah, vis-a-vis the dollars. I will say this very crudely. I'm not too worried, to be quite honest, about potential depreciation or devaluation of the rupiah. Even if we do nothing, or even if we were to do the massive stimulus package for the country or the citizens of the country, on the basis of the following. We saw in 2008 and 2009 how the Fed was able to print, $1.2 trillion in quantitative easing that was basically channeled to the Wall Street. And we saw how that actually had affected the depreciation of the US dollar across the world. Okay, how did it happen and why did it happen? What happened was that, as much as the intention of the Fed or the Central Bank of the United States was for the dollars to actually be moving into every direction in the United States, be it the people that needed the money to rebuild their homes, or the people that needed the money within the banking industry so that they could recapitalize themselves, it actually did not go holistically to the intended purposes or destinations. Some actually leaked out. And the amount of money that leaked out was enough. And it leaked out to the emerging economies, including Indonesia. As a result of which, it basically caused an oversupply of dollars, not only in the United States, but an oversupply of dollars in the rest of the world, including Indonesia. Now, when you have too much supply of something, the price of that comes down. So what happened was the price of the dollar, or the dollar value, came down in 2009, and we saw an appreciation of the rupiah. Now, fast forward to 2020, we have seen the printing or quantitative easing by the Fed amounting to about $2.5 trillion just in 3 weeks' time, whereas in 2008, 2009, it amounted to only $1.2 trillion. Okay? I anticipate or expect the same recurrence of what we saw in 2008, 2009 in terms of some of those dollars actually leaking out to beyond the borders of the United States, and it could very well hit the ground in Indonesia, so that we're likely to have some oversupply of the dollars, and that will only mean, a further depreciation of the dollar against not only, the rupiah, but many currencies around the world. So on that basis, I'm not too worried, irrespective of whether or not we do the quantitative easing in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Pak Gita. So those were questions from Muhammad Yasir Fatinsyah and Arkiko Giuliano. And would it be okay to take one more, Pak? We have one last question.
Sure.
Okay.
Fire away.
So this is from Nindya Natasasmita. Hi, I'm Nindya. Still related to the previous question regarding renewable energy. Do you foresee renewable energy investment become one of the economic stimulus options for Indonesia? If yes, what policy needs to be taken soon to make this happen?
I sure hope so, but I'm also realistic. At the moment, I think if we were to stimulate the economy, it would first have to be for social safety nets. And if we were to do anything beyond that, I think it would be for those that are actually at risk of, becoming permanently paralyzed, as opposed to just temporarily paralyzed. Unfortunately, those sectors are not yet in the renewable energy sector yet. And I think it's cause for concern on one hand, but on the other, I think it's cause for celebration in that, we're going to be able to see a more sustained recovery of the economy if the social safety nets are done, and the other corporations that are pre-existing within the balance sheet of the banking system. Not a whole lot of the renewable energy players are actually on the balance sheet of the Indonesian banks. Some that have been operating are actually on the balance sheet of foreign or international banks. But I do hope, again, that post the recovery from COVID-19, from an economic standpoint, I think policymakers are gonna come to a realization that any beneficiary of any support from the government ought to do something good for the planet. And fortunately, anything that's good for the planet is anything that's renewable. So we have to start from, I think, the recalibration of tariff for geothermal, which represents about 40% of the global sources or resources, and very little of those 40% resource or that 40% resource is being utilized yet. And secondarily, we can think of solar, but a lot of people or a lot of experts have been saying that solar energy, as much as there's a lot of sun in Indonesia because we're on the equator, but there's also a lot of clouds, and the clouds actually cover the sunlight, and that, I think, hampers the ability of the panels to absorb the sunlight, so that the generation of solar energy is limited. But in terms of wind, I'm not so sure, because there's only a very select few places in Indonesia that have tremendous wind power. But it will not be to the scale that we could potentially see with respect to geothermal. The last bit is hydro, and hydro, I think, has been done in some places. I know there's a huge hydro resource in Papua, which could amount to more than 10,000 megawatts worth of power generation capability. It's going to require massive amounts of capital expenditure. Right now, it's not the time to talk about capital expenditure, because we've got to talk about other things which would be needed for the preservation of livelihood, at least for the next 12 months.
Thank you very much for the time, Pak Gita, today. So apologies to all the attendees if I missed some of your questions, but hopefully you can join us again next time with Pak Gita and other speakers from SGPP. So once again, Pak Gita, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you. It's been a real honor and pleasure.
The pleasure is
Stay
ours.
healthy, guys.
Thank you, Pak.
Yeah.